Hi everyone! Today we're going to be working on something called main idea. So when you read a story or you write a story, you want to be thinking about the main idea, the most important thing of the story, or what is the story mostly about. So when you think about main idea, it's like the big picture. And then the details are all the tiny little pieces that make the story interesting or add something extra to it. So when you talk about main idea, you don't want to give all the little details. Main idea is like the big, most important part of the story. So take a look at this cake. So if I was to tell you, today I made a cake. That's like the main idea. It's the cake. I'm just saying that I made it. Now, if I'm going to add details, this is kind of like what I would be sharing with you. The details are there were 5 candles on it. It had green sprinkles. It was a vanilla cake. It had purple swirly icing. All these details are the tiny little parts that make it interesting and give you a better picture in your mind. Remember, we talked about making a picture or a movie in your mind. So the details help make that picture more interesting and more vibrant. The main idea is just the most important thing is that it's a cake. So details and main idea actually work together, but if you need to tell the main idea, you don't really need to tell all the little details of a story. You just want to tell the most important part, what it's mostly about. So let's practice a little bit. We read this tiny little story a long time ago, so we're just going to read it again and think about the main idea, not the details, but what's the big picture. Sarah lost her jacket at school yesterday. Her mom said she had to look for it. She looked in her classroom and out in the hall. She found it on the playground by the slide. She was glad she found her jacket. So, what is the main idea of this? Don't think about the details. She looked in the hall. She looked in her classroom. She looked by the slide. Those are the tiny little details. The main idea, even though this is a really short little mini story, it still has a main idea. What is it mostly about? And I would say, if I'm looking at clues in the title, Lost and Found, and I'm looking for clues even in the picture, and the words of the story also give you an idea. What is this mostly about? This little story is mostly about Sarah lost her jacket and then she found it. Done. Main idea is like just a quick snapshot of what the story is about. So if you were watching a movie, let's see, one of my favorite movies is Monsters, Inc. So if I was telling you about Monsters, Inc. and you said, Miss Horner, what is your favorite movie about? And I said, Monsters, Inc. And pretend you had never seen that movie and you said, what's it about? I wouldn't tell you every single minute of the movie because you could go watch the movie by yourself. If I'm just going to tell you what the movie's mostly about, the main idea of that movie is in the monster world, kids aren't allowed. And then when Boo accidentally comes into the monster world, it creates a big problem. So that's mostly what that movie is about. And there are tiny little details and little tiny things that happen that make it more interesting, but mostly that's what the movie's about. So, main idea is just the cake. It's mostly just the cake, but the details are what make it so interesting and fancy. So main idea is just saying a quick snapshot about what the story is. And that can go to you writing a story. If you just tell me the main idea, well, that's a good start, but I don't really have the picture in my mind. But if you're telling me the main idea of a story you read, you want to give me what it's mostly about. So today we're going to practice with one of my favorite books called The Big Orange Splot. And we're going to try to figure out what is the main idea of this book. And this one is by Daniel Manus Pinkwater. The Big Orange Splot. Mr. Plumbean lived on a street where all the houses were the same. He liked it that way. So did everybody else on Mr. Plumbean's street. This is a neat street, they would say. Then one day, a seagull flew over Mr. Plumbean's house. He was carrying a can of bright orange paint. No one knows why. And he dropped the can, no one knows why, right over Mr. Plumbean's house. It made a big orange splot on Mr. Plumbean's house. Ooh, too bad, everybody said. Mr. Plumbean will have to paint his house again. I suppose I will, said Mr. Plumbean, but he didn't paint his house right away. He looked at the big orange splot for a long time, and then he went about his business. The neighbors got tired of seeing that big orange splot. Someone said, Mr. Plumbean, we wish you'd get around to painting your house. Okay, said Mr. Plumbean. He got some blue paint and some white paint, and that night he got busy. He painted at night because it was cooler. When the paint was gone, the roof was blue, the walls were white, and the big orange splot was still there. And then he got some more paint. He got red paint, yellow paint, green paint, and purple paint. In the morning, the other people on the street came out of their houses. Their houses were all the same, but Mr. Plumbean's house was like a rainbow. It was like a jungle. It was like an explosion. And you can tell which one is his house, because these ones are all the same, and his is the fancy one. Look at that thing. There was the big orange splot, and there was little orange splots, and there were stripes. There were pictures of elephants and lions and pretty girls and steam shovels. The people said Plumbean has popped his cork, flipped his wig, blown his stack, and dropped his stopper. Those are all funny ways to say he's gone crazy. They went away muttering. That day, Mr. Plumbean bought carpenter's tools. That night, he built a tower on top of his roof, and he painted a clock on the tower. The next day, the people said, Plumbean has gushed his mush, lost his marbles, and slipped his hawser. They decided they would pretend not to notice. That very night, Mr. Plumbean got a truck full of green things. He planted palm trees, baobabs, thorn bushes, onions, and frangipani. In the morning, he bought a hammock and an alligator. When the other people came out of their houses, they saw Mr. Plumbean swinging in a hammock between two palm trees. They saw an alligator lying on the grass. Mr. Plumbean was drinking lemonade. Plumbean has gone too far. This used to be a neat street. Plumbean, what have you done to your house? The people shouted. My house is me and I am it. My house is where I like to be, and it looks like all my dreams, Mr. Plumbean said. The people went away. They asked the man who lived next door to Mr. Plumbean to go and have a talk with him. Tell him that we all liked it here before he changed his house. Tell him that his house has to be the same as ours so we can have a neat street. The man went to see Mr. Plumbean that evening. They sat under the palm trees drinking lemonade and talking all night long. Early the next morning, the man went out to get lumber and rope and nails and paint. When the people came out of their houses, they saw a red and yellow ship next door to the house of Mr. Plumbean. So you can tell in this part when they had their chat, he didn't really tell him what the people in the neighborhood wanted him to know. Now he's got a fun house. What have you done to your house? They shouted at the man. My house is me and I am it. My house is where I like to be and it looks like all my dreams, said the man who had always loved ships. He's just like Plumbean, the people said. He's got bees in his bonnet, bats in his belfry, and knots in his noodle. Then, one by one, they went to see Mr. Plumbean late at night. They would sit under the palm trees and drink lemonade and talk about their dreams. And whenever anybody visited Mr. Plumbean's house the very next day, that person would set about changing his own house to fit his dreams. And here are some examples of the houses. So now we've got a hot air balloon house. Looks like we've got a fancy palace house. Ooh, we've got an old castle house. Ooh, this one looks interesting, like an ancient Greek type of a house. Whenever a stranger came to the street of Mr. Plumbean and his neighbors, the stranger would say, "This is not a neat street." And then all the people would say, "Our street is us and we are it. Our street is where we like to be and it looks like all our dreams." And that's the end. So, this book is really cool because it has a lot of details and has a lot of interesting things that happen. But if you don't think about each tiny little detail and you just think about what is this book mostly about, what is the big idea of this story, you can tell me what is the main idea. So, the main idea of this book is what? You don't have to tell me that they drank lemonade under the palm trees, and you don't have to tell me that he added a clock tower at the top of his house, and you don't really have to tell me that there was a balloon house, a palace house, an ancient Greek house. Those are all the details that make it a fun and interesting story. I just want to know, what's the main idea? What's the big picture? What's the story mostly about that you can tell me? So you can send me a video, you can write and take a picture, you can type. Let me know, what do you think this story is mostly about? And that's the main idea.